Luke Pollard.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Pleasure to follow the Ombudsman for Telford, who has done so much to champion justice, especially for those people who have been abused as children. I welcome this bill and its provisions. The two halves that the Secretary of State spoke about, I will constrain my remarks to the points around the abuse that we saw in Plymouth of the babies and toddlers from Vanessa George. But first, Madam Speaker, can I just say I'm grateful for the Speaker and the Opposition for allowing me to speak from the back benches instead of my new usual spot on the front bench, as this is a very important constituency issue for those that I represent. Speaking up on behalf of those young people at Little Ted's nursery has been a privilege and an honour, but has been very difficult. Very difficult because the experiences that they've gone through have been so utterly harrowing. But because of the identities of the young children still being unknown and the desire to keep what's left of their childhood innocence in turn, that it has been a campaign that hasn't had as many people publicly in the media spotlight. And I want to start off by just thanking all the families for their courage, for their steadfast determination and for their love of their kids, for whom actually we would not be here today with this bill in front of us if it weren't for their work. I would love to name all of them to give them credit, but I would prefer to give them the even better privilege of just knowing that they were listened to and that their children can go along with their innocence along the way. Ever since the news of Vanessa George's release came to light, I've been campaigning to keep her behind bars. I am not a hang 'em and flog 'em politician. That's not my style. But when it comes to the abuse of babies and toddlers, what Vanessa George did, both in her acts and in her continual refusal to name which children she abused and which ones she didn't, has cast a whole new light about my views towards the parole board and her release. As the front benches have touched on, the case around Vanessa George is exceptionally disturbing. The abuse, the penetration of the babies and toddlers, the photographs of that penetration and that abuse is something that is really, really difficult for, I think, many of us to understand. How someone could do that, how someone could then share those images. The severity of that was part of the reason that she was given an indeterminate sentence for reasons of public protection. Now, the indeterminate sentence has complicated this case somewhat along the way due to its particular legal position. But when sentencing, the words of the judge to Vanessa George were quite profound. I cannot emphasise too strongly that this is not a 7-year sentence. It is emphatically not. It is, in effect, a life sentence. Many, and I suspect everyone so deeply affected by your dreadful deeds, will say that would be not a day too long. Those parents of those babies and toddlers were let down twice. Firstly, by a system that didn't protect their children in a place where they should have been safe. And secondly, as one parent told me through tears, that she was released, still not knowing the identity of those children. Now, when we talk about this, sometimes we talk about the identity of the victims. But in this case, it is not only the victims, it is those people, those young children who could be victims. Because we don't know precisely which children she abused. And to hear the stories of the parents about when this news came to light, of parents gathering in a hall and being separated into two groups. One group where she could have abused, and one group where they probably weren't abused. To hear of the distinction between friends being separated into two groups is just harrowing. I'll return to it in a moment, but there is an element about communication which is also key here, because many of those families heard about this on social media. Now, the campaign that we started after the release, apparent to myself, not only called for a change of law, which is what we're seeing here today, but it also called for a change in the way that the parole board works. And I think the remarks of the Ombudsman for Telford, who just spoke about the operational side of this, is also really important, because a change in the law is important to keep people like Vanessa George behind bars. But how that is communicated and how parents and victims are involved in that is especially important. I want to echo the words of my honourable friend for St Helens North in thanking the Secretary of State for the way he has engaged with this. I think there is much in this place that is a disappointment. But in this case, the cross-party working, the professional way that not only he but his ministers have engaged with myself and the concerns of the family is truly remarkable. And I think It's an example that shows cross-party working can deliver the results, and I want to thank him sincerely for his work.
Would you like me to speak?
Happy to give him away.
Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you for allowing me to intervene. I would agree, would you agree that this is a commendable step brought forward, first of all, through Mary McCourt's tremendous efforts over 32 years, and the Honourable Member for St Helens North in bringing this forward, this huge step in the right direction for justice for victims, which we've still got a long way to go, but it's a huge step. Would you agree with that?
I thank my friend for that intervention, and I think the way that the ministers have merged together two campaign asks in a single piece of natural justice, I think is quite sensible. There are some concerns that I have. I personally still think Vanessa George should be behind bars. I don't see how a woman who refuses to name the children she abused should have been let out. And indeed, I believe that if you abuse a child, the state should say for the childhood of that victim, that perpetrator should be behind bars, giving their entirety of what remains their childhood in a protected space, away from the accuser. The fact that Vanessa George has been released without naming the children that she abused, I think shows that there was something not right with the law. And the experience of many of the parents throughout this process has been to stumble across deficiencies and difficulties in the way that this has worked. And that is something that I believe needs to be addressed in the way that this is going.
Ask him, with all his experience in this tragic case, does he believe that the fault lay with inadequate powers by the parole board in that they felt they had no option, or did they have the power not to release Vanessa George and not choose to exercise that power, in which case is there something terribly wrong with the recruitment practices to membership of the parole board?
The Honourable Member raises a very, very good point. I would not wish to sit on a parole board for all the money in the world. It must be an incredibly difficult decision to be able to choose whether to keep what in many cases are very serious offenders behind bars or not. In respect of Vanessa George, I think the parole board had no choice in relation to releasing her. And that's why this change of law is so essential in terms of doing that. And indeed, the calls that I made initially to the Secretary of State for the investigation to be reopened, to make sure that there was no stone left unturned, no charge that wasn't put against her to try and keep her behind bars, and the dedication and professionalism of Devon and Cornwall Police in reopening that file and making sure there was nothing left in there, I think showed that the system had done as much as it could do. And that is why a change in law is absolutely necessary in terms of ensuring that we can keep someone like Vanessa George behind bars. Now, the concerns that I have about how this law will be implemented, I think I'm grateful if the Minister could address briefly in his concluding remarks. There are very few, thankfully, cases like Vanessa George. Very few cases where there has been child abuse on this scale that has come to light where the names have been withheld. But there are many more cases where the charge of taking indecent image of a child sits alongside other more serious offences as well. And what I'm uncertain about from reading the bill is how this could work with additional charges where there is a primary charge or a most severe charge, and this is another one. If that conviction is spent on the first charge, does the ability to withhold information from a subsequent charge of taking indecent images mean that the whole sentence could be locked down? Secondly, there is a concern, and that was mentioned by my honourable friend from the front bench, who I think made a very professional debut at the dispatch box, about what happens to Vanessa George in particular about licence conditions. So I'm grateful for the parole board setting such comprehensive licence conditions. That means she can't go back to Plymouth. She should never bump into or be seen near any of the children that she abused, nor should she ever be able to access the internet. You can now buy internet-enabled fridges, and there is a real difficulty, I think, in enforcing some of the minor points of that. But if a licence condition is now triggered and she is recalled to jail, can I ask the Minister whether the conditions that hopefully will pass into law with this bill would then subsequently apply, or whether they have fallen away and it's only for future offences that now apply? Very briefly, Madam Deputy Speaker, because I'm grateful for the time the House affords me here, the operation of the experience around Vanessa George has shown it's not only deficiency in the words of the law that needs to be looked at, it's the whole journey for victims, in particular for those brave and courageous parents who gave evidence at the parole hearings. I would like the government to look at introducing a system of video links for parents to be able to, or for victims to be able to give evidence. Going into a jail where the perpetrator of such heinous crimes against their children is being held, especially when that jail is far away from where they live, is a really harrowing experience. And the ability to have a video link from your local court is something that is commonly held in the rest of the criminal justice system, but not in the parole board. Secondly, there's an element about communications. Many of the parents who were involved with the Vanessa George case found out on Facebook or via our local paper. Now, that is not because, I think, of a lack of willingness from the authorities to keep their information, but it's that after 10 years of changing email addresses, changing addresses, and for some parents, the stress of the abuse breaking the relationship, meaning that the communication point was held by one person in a couple, but now they've gone separate ways, not both of them, I think requires to look at this again. And I would encourage the Secretary of State to look at the principle that was adopted with the new organ donation law of an opt-out system. So everyone, especially for these most severe cases, is automatically included in the system, unless, for very good reasons that I think we can all understand, those people choose to opt out of getting regular updates. I think would make a substantial difference along the way. I think there is a real opportunity to take some of the lessons learned from the Vanessa George case and to make not only better law, but better operation of how the parole board works. Those children that she abused, many of them, I believe, still don't know what has happened to them. Many of them will not know how they feel and why they are feeling the way they do because of their childhood experiences. They will not know about what's going on. For many of those parents, having spoken to them, the daily worry about what happens if my child asks me about her, what happens if they ask, did I go to that nursery? These are live questions for many of these parents, and those parents and those children have a life sentence ahead of them. There is no escape from that sentence, just as they're not for, as the member for St Helens North mentioned, if you can't have a body to bury. There is no escape from the realities of this. And so, and now Vanessa George has been released, she may be watching these proceedings. And to her, I say, name those children, name the kids, and let's give those families the peace that they deserve. Thank you.